welcome to the Purple Warriors podcast. I'm your host, Ali Sugars, and thank you for joining us. This podcast is about raising awareness for domestic and family abuse by allowing survivors to share their own journeys to recovery. You will find practical yet powerful information and tools that you can implement immediately in your own recovery journey, as well as information on how you can help someone that you think may be in a toxic relationship. Hosts and guests will often discuss sensitive topics in detail, and while this is done with the utmost respect and dignity, it may cause triggers for some listeners. We are really privileged today to have a returning guest to the podcast. We have Sarah Reimann, who is a speaker coach and mentor in finance for small business. So welcome back to the podcast, Sarah.
Thanks, Ali. Thanks for having me back. It's great to be here.
It's fantastic. So, Sarah, you were our very first guest in our very first podcast. So just let us know a little bit about why you decided to come back today and share with us in more detail about your own personal story.
Well, I think we all need to take every opportunity we can in life, and it doesn't matter what it's about or what we're talking about. It's great to get our story out there. It's great to encourage other people with our story, and that's what I hope to do is to help and encourage other women to know that perhaps they're not alone, because some of us can think that we're alone in some of this stuff, and we're certainly not, that's for sure. So that's why I came back.
That is so true. We are not alone. There are so many of us out there. It's phenomenal when we all step forward to be as brave as you are and share our personal stories. So tell us, Sarah, when did your experiences in abuse begin?
Well, I was a teenager. I was quite young. I was just thinking about it before I came onto the podcast, and I was really quite young. I was 15 or 16. And it wasn't at home, it was more with boyfriends. So I got to sort of 14, 15, 16, got involved with some untoward men, I suppose, that were a little bit older than me. And that went on for about 5 years. Looking back, I think my mother, in a way, abused me emotionally, perhaps not physically, but emotionally she did. With anger, she had anger issues, and she struggled with her own depression and anxiety when I was a kid. I was a fairly strong-willed child, if you want to call it like that, and she perhaps didn't know how to deal with that. So when I got involved in these relationships with these men, I was only a teenager. I was only a kid, really, and I was naive. I didn't know what was going to happen. I moved out of home at 16, and I moved in with someone who was he was well into his late 20s. He might have even been 30. I can't quite remember the age difference now. And that went on. He was a drunk too, so he would regularly drink a whole bottle of Jack Daniels in one night. There was marijuana and drugs and stuff going on in the house we were living in, which just added to the the confusion and the hurt and the pain and everything like that, because there was a whole lot of people coming and going from the house that weren't the best. So, and it was more, I'd say it was physical, but it was a lot more emotional than anything. It wasn't like I sort of got really beaten up and went to hospital or anything like that. That didn't really ever happen. It was more emotional stuff, more of a, you have to do things and I want you to do this and you better do it or else. And just stuff like that went on for about 4 or 5 years. And I left home because I didn't like the environment at home. Mum and Dad were together. Look, they loved me and stuff, but for some reason I just thought, nah, I'm going to do it better, and moved out. And then I found myself in this situation. I'd moved out. I was in a house. It's a lot harder to get out of a relationship when you're actually in the same house together. And so it took, it was about four years that I was there. And I remember on my 20th birthday, which was 1990, gosh, I got to think now, 1995, right? So do the math on that. I actually I'd rung my mum a few weeks before and said to her, look, I need to get out of this relationship. I knew they had a van because Dad had a business, and she just come around one day. We packed up as much as I could while my partner was at work, you know, just my belongings type of thing into the van, and just left when he wasn't there. And then I got in my car and drove to Melbourne and lived there for 6 months to get away from the whole sort of lifestyle that I'd created in Adelaide. So yeah, that's kind of a nutshell.
Well, thank you for sharing that. You know, that's really brave, Sarah, for sharing that information with us. So maybe tell us about what are the after effects in your life that has created now that, you know, as you got older, as you went on in life.
So, as I said, I left the relationship when I was 20. It sort of didn't stop there. The person that I was with sort of tried to find me and find out where I was. And so there was probably a year or so after that where, you know, he sort of caused up a few problems and dramas. And I did come back to Adelaide eventually, and he still was trying to pursue me and stuff like that. So, but within sort of 18 months or so, that all stopped. And then I met my first husband, and we got married when I was about 24, and we had our child. But I found that it hadn't, the flow-on effects I didn't realise was post-traumatic stress disorder. And at the time, I had no idea and no concept of what that was. So I was sitting there with a newborn, sort of, you know, we're talking 3 or 4 years down the track, and having what I called these daytime nightmares, where I'd have flashes before my eyes of the incidences that had happened back when I was in the house with that person, of, you know, of the abuse, of the trauma, of that sort of stuff. So I said at the time, I mean, my husband, he was only 23 or 24 too, we were all pretty young. I said to him, this is what's, and he didn't know either. And so I went to some counselling. I went and saw a lady for some counselling. She was a part of church, and she delved into, you know, the things that had happened in the past. There was also some trauma in terms of I had, I hope this is all right to say this, that I'd had a couple of abortions as well when I was a teenager.
That's fine to say that.
Yeah. And so there was obviously trauma from that too, which I didn't, you know, again, I didn't realise because I hadn't been, I don't know, educated or taught on these things. I think these days there's probably a lot more education around that stuff, and it's a lot more out in the open than it was back then. So she went through all of these things. She went back into my childhood and said, what happened as a child? And I was saying to her, my childhood was fine. Like, my mum and dad were together. They brought me up. They were fine. And she kept delving, and she said, no, something happened. You know, tell me about your mum. Tell me about your parents. And what it uncovered was, and this is in no means throwing my mum and dad under the bus at all, might sound like it is that there was trauma from mum and dad. Like, as I said, my mum had her own negative issues. She had her own depression and anxiety, and she deflected that onto me, and she used to yell at me and call me names, and she couldn't handle, you know, the way that I was, whatever. But I thought in my own mind, oh, that was just me, because that's what they told me. Mum and dad had told me, you're doing the wrong thing, you're rebellious, you shouldn't be doing that. You know, they didn't really, that's what I heard in my mind. So I just thought to myself when I got into my 20s, and oh no, I did the wrong thing. But when I went to counselling, it uncovered that no, you know, parents do have a massive influence on us. And I just didn't realise that. So I'd somehow got into this abusive relationship with this person, this man, because that's what I'd known as a child. And so I got into this relation, and that's what she uncovered, this counsellor. I mean, it's a long time ago now that I went to this counselling, so I'm trying to uncover it. And so we went through a few sessions, and it uncovered these things. And she just, yeah, and I had to, because I otherwise I couldn't. The post-traumatic stress disorder just doesn't go away. It just doesn't go, like for me, it didn't go away without that sort of therapy and without that sort of counselling. I never went on antidepressants, or I never medicated. I never got diagnosed with anything. And then flow-on effects from that is sort of like 10 years ago, I found myself in a marriage split up. My husband of 10 years moved out. We had major issues, and I fell into this really deep, dark depression for about 3 years. And for me, that was about 2009, 10, 11. For me at the time, this is worse than the abuse. It felt to me like it was worse than the abuse. And the reason I felt like that was because I had 2 young children there, and the guilt I felt from a marriage split up. My husband wasn't ever abusive. He was fine. He was probably just a bit laid back and neglectful, if anything, not abusive, but then again, neglect, they say, is a form of abuse too. So
Right.
I found myself just thinking, you know, how could I let my marriage split up? My kids are going to be damaged for life, you know, all these sort of things. And it went on for about 3 years. And again, I had to get counselling for some of that and just work through the issues, just talking to someone that is objective, that a counsellor person that isn't your family or isn't your friends, and they're just a little bit removed, and they can see the situation from the outside and go, hang on, what about this and what about that? And again, I didn't want to go on medication. That was my choice. I know some people need to. I didn't really ever go to the doctor for help. I really went to counselling and therapy, and that was the way that I sort of eventually came out of that. I mean, there wasn't any defining moment. I could say, look back 10 years, 2010 was one of I labelled it my worst year ever. And now it's 2020 and I'm going, crap, that was 10 years ago. Wow, you know. And there was a whole lot of other things around that too. But I think it was just a process, like getting out of that back in, and I was obviously in my early 30s, was, you know, and when I do some presentations, I talk about what helped me get out of that depression later in life. And it was you know, friends, talking to people, talking to the counsellor, talking to friends. I pushed away all of my friends at that time. I hadn't, because I felt this massive amount of guilt because of a marriage breakdown. I pushed them all away. Well, that was the worst thing you can ever do, because isolation fuels depression. And again, I didn't realise this until later. I started exercising, I started running, I started eating better, just all the, like, I call it friends, family, food, fitness. I think the 4 Fs, you know, those are the sort of things that helped me, like, get better with the depression. And it took a while. And just deliberately changing the way that you are thinking about stuff. So when I had all these negative thoughts of, you're hopeless, you're useless, you've got a marriage breakdown, your kids are going to be, you know, all these bombardment of negative stuff going on, is that I just had to actually write a whole list of positive affirmations out. This is what my counsellor told me to do, and just repeat them every day. And it feels like you're silly, like you're talking to yourself, but it actually works. And I still do some of that even to this day. And it was just, it was basically, my thinking was killing me, really was. Yeah.
Yeah, it's isn't it amazing to, when you think back on it, to realise, you know, how something that happened to you back when you were 15, 16, how like you say, the after effects throughout your whole life. And another thing that you said just then, you know, is that you went and got professional help. I love that you gave the differentiation between you know, talking to your friends and family, which is one thing, but when you go and get professional help, that is, you know, they can, like you say, remove themselves from the situation and come in from a totally outside perspective. And isn't that awesome when that happens, when you can, you know, I mean, not that it's awesome that you realised, you know, that back when it stemmed from, which was parents, but it kind of gives you clarity, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And in some ways you don't know what you don't know. You know, most people aren't trained in school in psychology or communication or human interaction or anything like that. We learn that later on, or we learn it from books or from training or anything like that. And it's just like, I mean, I help people with finances, is, again, you know, sometimes we don't learn that stuff at school. We don't learn financial literacy at school, so we need to be taught it. We need to learn it later on to get better at it. And it's the same, I suppose, with human psychology, is we need to learn how to be better interactors and better communicators, actually understand why these things happened, instead of actually blaming ourselves, because it's not always, you know, something we've done or anything like that. It's not always that, and just learning something from like a professional and getting help from professionals is really important. Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. 100% agree with that. So, Sarah, if you could go back and you could talk to young Sarah before any of this happened, knowing what was to come, what would you say to her?
What would I say? Gosh.
It's a toughie, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, barring "don't do that, you idiot," you know, like, yeah, that's one thing. In some ways, like now, I'm 45 this year. In some ways, looking back, there's one part of me that goes, I'm glad I went through that, because there's so many people that perhaps I've seen the really, really bad part of life, of society, of how people can live in terrible circumstances and situations where there's drugs and alcohol and in a home where it's just dysfunctional and destructive. I've seen that firsthand. And there's many people in life that just haven't seen that. And maybe we could say they're the lucky ones, but maybe also it gives you a different perspective on life. It makes you more appreciative of the fact that now I've got a really good life. Like, I'm probably at the best I ever have been in the last, few years, in the last 5 years. So I'm not sure, would I have liked to have not gone through those experiences? Probably yes. At the time, they were extremely traumatic, and I didn't think I was going to survive. In my 30s, when I had that depression, I even thought about suicide and stuff like that, but my young children kept me from that. I didn't want them to grow up without a mother, so that wasn't a choice. But it crossed my mind, that's for sure. But I think I'd say to her, be strong and resilient to get through this, because looking back, I must have been strong and resilient as a 19 or 20-year-old. I must have been, to actually survive that stuff. But, I'm not sure what advice. Just hang in there. It's going to get better.
Awesome.
This is a learning ground for your future. And maybe even when you talk, I've got a 9 to 18 and 20-year-old too. Perhaps when you say those things to your kids, they just think, But it is certainly a training ground for life when you go through that stuff. However, I don't wish it upon anyone,
Oh, yeah.
To learn that stuff that way. But now, even just when I talk to people, even my husband, we've been together for a while now. He's a little bit older than me, but he's never seen that side of life. He's always had a really sort of good life, good upbringing. He's never had any, taken drugs or anything, been in any of those sort of situations. And so he doesn't, he gets it, but he doesn't understand, and then when you see things on the news, and I just say to him, but that's how some people live, that's some people, that the way that those people live is just not the norm for them, unfortunately. Yeah.
Mm. That's brilliant. So that's great. So that's the advice you would give to yourself. Would you give the same or different advice to maybe, our fellow survivors who are recovering or maybe still dealing with abuse?
Look, I think if you are in that situation right now, is the best advice is it's okay to leave. Because I think when like for me, I was in a house for 4 years with someone that abused me daily, really. I kept thinking, how do I get out of this? I can't leave, all of these sort of things. Oh, it's too hard to leave because of X, this and this. There was no children involved then, but if people do have children involved, I guess you've just got to think of your long-term mental health, your long-term sanity, recognise that it is abuse and that it's not your fault. Because when I was in it, it was the blame game. Oh, it's my fault because I've done this, this and this. No, you haven't. You actually haven't. It's that the person that's abusing you there's an old saying, hurt people hurt people. So that the abuser is normally a person that has been hurt and abused in their own life. And so they're then just deflecting that onto you. So I would say get out of the situation as soon as possible. Ask family and friends for help. Do not push friends away. That was the worst thing I ever did, was push a whole lot of long-term friends away and not talk to anyone for probably a couple of years. Because people are willing to listen, people are willing to help. Don't feel ashamed, and don't feel like you're going to get judged, because you're not.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and you need to just don't put up with it. If someone's abusing you emotionally and even physically, then that is a surefire sign that you need to get out of there, for sure.
Absolutely. So we're going to keep on the advice track. So thinking of someone who, might think or know someone who is in an abusive situation, and they say they've got a friend that they know is being abused and they want to help them in some way, what would the best advice be that you could give to them in how they might be able to help their friend or family member?
Well, I mean, you've got to give them practical things, I suppose. We can sort of say a whole lot of words, but I think in the end it's giving practical help. So a bed to sleep in.
Beautiful.
Cook them a meal. Tell them that your house, if you can, I know we don't all have a huge house with lots of spare beds, but we've all possibly got a lounge or some sort of space for that person to come and stay. Especially if it's dangerous and they really need to get out, and so that person doesn't find them. Offer your house as a safe haven if you can, or find other people that can house that person. I think practical things is what abused people need. Practical stuff, clothes, they might need food, they might need to be taken to the doctor, they might need to borrow your car for a couple of hours, within reason. Just stuff like that. I think it's practical help, and making sure that even perhaps ringing the person too, because sometimes we can be, we tell people, look, ring me any time and ask for help, but they won't, so I think reaching out to them and saying, look, can I cook you a meal tonight? Do you need it? Look, do you want to, regularly keeping in touch with them, I think is a good thing.
That is really true, because I know for myself, and I know a lot of other people who, when they've gone through this, one of the hardest things to do can actually be to put yourself out there and ask for help. So, when you've got someone that is in this situation, it might take you to go to them. So don't wait for, these people who are in need to come to you.
And even the best of us find it hard to ask for help. Even in my line of work, business owners who are struggling find it hard. Now, they might not be going through domestic violence or abuse, but they may be struggling a bit financially in business, and even then they find it hard. And I've had to learn that over the years, even as an accountant and stuff, is that you need to keep in touch with your client. You need to ring up and see how they're going and see if they're doing all right, because people generally think, oh no, I don't want to ask for help, or they ask for it too late, or and then you're into fixing up mode type of thing. So yeah, I think, and definitely for someone that's in that sort of environment, it would maybe be even harder for them to ask for help.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much today for coming on again, Sarah, and sharing your story with us and your experiences and brilliant advice that you've given. So now, if our listeners would like to hear more about what Sarah does and some fantastic tips on budgeting and how to track your expenses, you can go back to our very first episode on the podcast and have a listen. And also, what is your website address, Sarah, where they can find more details out about you?
It's www.sarahreimann, so it's sarahreimann.com.au. And I've got Facebook, and I'm on LinkedIn as well, so you can connect with me all over the place.
Excellent stuff. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thanks, Ali. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure and a joy.
Absolutely. I hope hope you enjoyed today's show, and thanks for listening. If you would like to share your story of survival, or you have a topic you would like to hear about on the program, reach out to me via email, welcome@themotivationmama.com, or find me, The Motivation Mama, on Instagram or Facebook. And don't forget, the greatest project that you will ever work on is you. Happy day, beautiful.